Some minds walk into a room and instantly feel what others are desperately trying to hide. Not because they are suspicious, not because they are anxious, but because something in their perception is tuned beyond the ordinary rhythm of social reality. And according to the analytical observations of Carl Jung, this heightened awareness was never a gift without consequence. In fact, he quietly suggested that the ability to perceive too much, too clearly, and too deeply may be one of the most psychologically dangerous forms of consciousness a person can possess. Jung did not arrive at this conclusion through theory alone. He encountered it through real individuals whose perception operated on a level that disrupted ordinary social functioning. In his clinical reflections, he described patients who displayed what could be understood as differentiated perception, an unusual sensitivity to unconscious signals, emotional atmospheres, hidden tensions, and subtle psychological patterns that most people instinctively overlook. These individuals did not merely listen to words. They sensed contradictions behind them. They did not just observe expressions. They perceived suppressed emotion beneath the surface. Social masks appeared transparent to them, and this clarity, rather than empowering them, often isolated them. One particularly revealing case emerged during a psychologically turbulent period in Jung's own life, shortly after his separation from Sigmund Freud. Around 1913, he documented the experience of a deeply introverted and intuitive patient whose awareness of psychological atmospheres was almost immediate and involuntary. She would enter environments and intuitively grasp who was emotionally distressed, who was concealing resentment, and who was presenting a false persona. Jung noted that her observations, when carefully examined, were not delusional distortions. They were frequently accurate. Yet instead of benefiting her socially, this clarity created tension in every interaction. She struggled with casual conversation because superficial exchanges felt psychologically dishonest to her. Friendships became strained because people sensed that their internal states were being unconsciously read. Professional environments became difficult because her presence disrupted unspoken group dynamics that rely on collective denial and emotional suppression. Jung gradually realized he was not witnessing pathology in the traditional sense. He was observing what happens when unconscious perception becomes conscious to a degree that exceeds social tolerance. He later explored this phenomenon through the concept of participation mystique, a term describing the psychological state in which personal boundaries become permeable to unconscious emotional material from others. Jung proposed that certain individuals possess a psychic sensitivity so refined that they do not merely process spoken communication, but absorb the entire unconscious atmosphere of their surroundings. This absorption is rarely understood by the individual experiencing it. Instead, it manifests as unexplained emotional exhaustion, social overwhelm, and a persistent sense of psychological heaviness. Decades later, modern research by Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons echoed aspects of Jung's early observations, suggesting that a portion of the population demonstrates increased sensory and emotional responsiveness. However, Jung's typological framework went further. Within his psychological typology, he identified the introverted intuitive type as exceptionally rare, individuals who do not merely feel deeply, but perceive unconscious patterns with unusual clarity. Their cognition appears oriented toward symbolic meaning, latent motivations, and future psychological trajectories rather than surface-level social cues. These individuals often detect the sadness hidden behind polite smiles, the anxiety beneath confident speech, and the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree not to acknowledge. Jung emphasized that the danger was not the perception itself. The danger was the isolation it produced. When one consistently perceives what others deny, one becomes, psychologically, a mirror that reflects truths people are not prepared to confront. And mirrors that reveal uncomfortable realities are rarely welcomed. This dynamic connects directly to Jung's extensive work on shadow projection. When an individual's perception reflects suppressed qualities back to others, the unconscious response is often defensive hostility rather than introspection. Jung wrote in his analytical works that what disturbs us in others frequently reveals something unexamined within ourselves. Yet confronting the shadow requires psychological maturity. Attacking the mirror is easier than integrating what the mirror reveals. As a result, highly perceptive individuals are often blamed for tensions they merely observe. Their insights are interpreted as negativity. Their accuracy is perceived as judgment. Their awareness is reframed as emotional intrusion. Over time, Jung noticed a recurring pattern. The person who sees clearly becomes the psychological scapegoat within groups. Not because they create problems, but because they make existing problems visible. This phenomenon creates a subtle but persistent sense of being targeted, misunderstood, or emotionally rejected without any obvious rational cause. From a Jungian perspective, this is not coincidence. It is a defense mechanism of the collective psyche. Yet Jung's deeper concern extended beyond social reactions. He identified multiple ways in which overwhelming perception manifests, depending on the individual's psychological structure. Some combine intuition with strong feeling, leading them to absorb the emotional states of others so intensely that distinguishing between personal emotion and absorbed emotion becomes difficult. Others exhibit a thinking intuitive pattern, perceiving long-term psychological outcomes through unconscious pattern recognition rather than logical deduction. Some display a sensation-intuitive sensitivity, detecting physical signs of psychological distress in others before those signs are consciously acknowledged. And the rarest group, the pure intuitive type, experiences continuous influx of unconscious impressions without sufficient psychological organization to process them coherently, resulting in chronic overwhelm. For Jung, the true danger of heightened perception unfolded in three distinct psychological consequences. First, disruption of collective unconscious agreements. Social groups maintain stability partly through shared illusions about what will and will not be acknowledged. An individual who sees through these illusions unintentionally destabilizes group cohesion simply by existing authentically. Second, profound psychological isolation. Jung described this as the curse of unshared consciousness, the experience of inhabiting a level of awareness that cannot be easily communicated or validated by one's environment. This isolation is not merely social. It becomes existential, creating the sensation of living in a different psychological reality from those around you. Third, identity dissolution. When individuals continually absorb unconscious material from others, their internal boundaries weaken. Over time, they may lose clarity about their own authentic emotions, values, and identity. Jung referred to this boundary erosion as participation mystique, warning that excessive immersion in collective unconscious content could lead to a partial loss of individuality. The mind becomes flooded with psychological impressions that do not originate from the self, yet feel internally real. Without conscious differentiation, the person risks psychological exhaustion and internal fragmentation. To address this, Jung developed the individuation process, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a practical psychological path. The first stage involves conscious discrimination, learning to distinguish what belongs to one's own psyche from what has been unconsciously absorbed from the environment. Jung often encouraged solitude as a necessary practice, not as avoidance, but as a method of psychological recalibration. In stillness, external emotional residues gradually settle, allowing the authentic inner voice to reemerge. The second stage centers on shadow integration. Jung observed that individuals who perceive the shadow in others with exceptional clarity often have unresolved shadow elements within themselves. Integration does not mean moral failure. It means acknowledging the full spectrum of human potential within one's own psyche, including traits one may prefer to deny. This internal honesty reduces emotional reactivity to external observations and prevents projection. The third stage involves conscious participation. Rather than withdrawing from the social world or becoming overwhelmed by it, the individuated person learns to engage with psychological environments while maintaining internal boundaries. Jung described this as developing psychological containers, the capacity to hold awareness of others' unconscious material without internalizing it as one's own identity. Historical examples deeply influenced Jung's understanding of integrated and unintegrated perception. He examined the philosophical intensity of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose penetrating insight into human nature was accompanied by profound psychological struggle. Jung interpreted Nietzsche's trajectory as an illustration of what can occur when superior perception remains unbalanced and psychologically unintegrated. In contrast, he studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart as an example of perception integrated with humility and spiritual grounding, allowing insight to transform into wisdom rather than alienation. Perhaps most revealing was Jung's own confrontation with the unconscious during the period he later documented in his personal writings. He acknowledged being psychologically overwhelmed by the intensity of unconscious material emerging within his own mind. Yet, through disciplined observation, symbolic analysis, and structured inner work, he gradually transformed overwhelming perception into a coherent psychological framework that would shape analytical psychology itself. This experience led him to conclude that heightened perception is not inherently pathological. It may represent an advanced stage of consciousness development that demands equally advanced integration. However, Jung also warned about specific psychological traps. One is inflation, where the individual identifies excessively with their perceptive ability and begins to view themselves as uniquely enlightened or separate from humanity. Another is withdrawal, where social disengagement is rationalized as wisdom rather than recognized as defensive isolation. A third is identity fusion with the helper role, where one's entire sense of self becomes dependent on interpreting and assisting others psychologically, leading to burnout and loss of personal development. And finally, regression during stress, when psychological boundaries weaken and absorbed unconscious material again becomes overwhelming. For Jung, the ultimate transformation of heightened perception involved a shift from burden to service. Not service rooted in sacrifice or martyrdom, but service grounded in conscious individuality. He believed that individuals who successfully integrate their perception function as cultural carriers, helping to bring unconscious psychological patterns into awareness before they manifest destructively within collective behavior. In works such as The Undiscovered Self, He emphasized that meaningful societal change often begins with individuals who develop consciousness ahead of their cultural environment. This perspective reframes isolation not as failure, but as a transitional phase in psychological development. Jung suggested that highly perceptive individuals benefit greatly from relationships with psychologically minded people, those capable of introspection, emotional stability, and curiosity about inner reality. Such relationships provide validation without defensiveness and allow perception to be expressed constructively rather than suppressed. Over time, the transformation becomes evident. Perception remains intact, but the relationship to perception changes. Instead of reacting to every psychological signal, the individual learns discernment. Instead of absorbing every emotional atmosphere, they maintain boundaries. Instead of interpreting their awareness as a curse, they recognize it as a complex psychological function requiring conscious management. Jung's most unsettling insight was not that some individuals see more than others. It was that many who possess this clarity never learn how to integrate it. The result is chronic overwhelm, alienation, and internal confusion. Yet when integration occurs, the same perception that once created suffering becomes a source of depth, empathy, and psychological wisdom. You are not overwhelmed because you perceive too much. You are overwhelmed because perception without integration floods the psyche faster than it can be processed. The task is not to dull awareness in order to fit collective unconscious comfort. The task is to strengthen inner structure so awareness can exist without fragmentation. In this sense, perception is neither a flaw nor a superiority. It is a responsibility of consciousness. Jung ultimately believed that individuals capable of perceiving unconscious patterns serve an evolutionary psychological role. They sense tensions within the collective before those tensions become visible crises. They detect emotional contradictions before they manifest as relational breakdowns. They notice internal dissonance before it becomes destructive behavior. When integrated, such awareness becomes a quiet form of cultural medicine rather than a personal burden. So the real danger was never the clarity itself. The danger was unconscious relationship to that clarity. When awareness operates without grounding, it isolates. When grounded through individuation, it transforms. The mind that sees deeply does not need to withdraw from the world. It needs to engage with it more consciously, with humility, boundaries, and psychological discipline. And perhaps this is the deeper reflection Jung left behind. Consciousness does not evolve by suppressing perception. It evolves by learning to hold perception without being consumed by it. If you recognize within yourself this unusual sensitivity to emotional atmospheres, hidden motives, and unspoken psychological tensions, it may not indicate that you are too much for the world. It may indicate that your inner awareness requires a more deliberate form of integration than most people are ever taught. In the end, the question is not whether you should see less. It is whether you will learn to see wisely. Because the mind that learns to balance perception with integration does not become isolated from humanity. It becomes more capable of understanding it. And if this exploration of hidden psychology, consciousness, and inner awareness resonates with you, then remain with Beyond the Twist, where each reflection is not meant to overwhelm the mind, but to deepen it quietly.